This is where all the examples start to be about furries for no particular reason.
More fuzzy, yeah.
Yes, it is more fuzzy. That is correct. Ah.
That was a good joke.
Never heard that. I thought it was about apples.
I don't know. It's a pixel.
Oh.
It's a G.
That looks like
G for
what?
G off.
Oh.
See? G for Google.
Oh, for Google.
Are you talking about this course?
No, sorry, the overall semester.
I'm just kidding. I can't wait till it's over either. I'm right there with you. All right. It's about the part of the semester where you start to wonder what's in the coffee cup, right? Okay, let's jump in. All right. So So before I get started, I'm about halfway through marking the midterms. Hopefully, I will have time tomorrow. I thought I would have time today, but I didn't. Lots of people showed up to ask questions about the midterm in sociology of youth. So no worries. I will get it done tomorrow, I hope. Looks pretty good so far. I don't have too many concerns. Some people might have their grades back already because I didn't hide them. I just made them available the moment I mark it. But yeah, I don't know why I'm just randomly doodling things on my slide. Yes, that is a furry. It's a kitty. I'm bad at drawing. I'm sorry. Okay, so any questions about the major lab or anything? Any questions you want to ask? I know some people have come to talk to me already. If not, we're going to jump into the second part of the course. We're going to talk about qualitative research. So all of those things that we learned in quantitative research that were on the first midterm, you can now forget about all that stuff, except take it into life with you. But for the purposes of the final exam, none of that stuff will be on the final. The final is going to be all qual methods, except when we get to mixed methods. Because with mixed methods, we got to talk about quant again. But we'll get to that right at the end of the course, which is, coming. What do we have, 5 weeks left? Yeah, what's up?
I was just wondering, once all the midterms are done, are we going to have the opportunity to somehow review the answers that we got wrong?
Absolutely. You can come and talk to me. Basically, I am trying to protect both my short answer questions and my multiple choice questions. But yeah, we can book an appointment and you can come in and go through it and all that stuff. I'll hand you an iPad. You can look through it and ask me. You can ask me any questions you have. I'm sorry, I've been talking for an hour and my brain is broken. All right, yes, you'll have a chance to review, I promise. It won't be like, no, you may never know what you got wrong. It's a mystery. That would be a much easier way to maintain a class average, though. I will say that. Okay. I don't know why I circled record keeping. I'm in a silly mood. We were talking about a really... Share? No, I'm kidding.
You want a piece?
No, I'm good. Share? I'm in a really silly mood. We were just talking about a super fun topic in sociology of youth, and it always puts me in kind of a silly mood, and now I'm like, wah wah. All right, let's talk qual research. Okay, so as we know, because we talked about this at the beginning of the course, but just to reaffirm, right, and review, we're talking about qualitative research. It is mostly not about numbers. It is about people's experiences, right, and putting that into words and images. So it is all about painting a word portrait, right, describing in great detail what's going on in the social world. Usually it is inductive, right? So usually it starts from data and it develops into a theory. And not for nothing, right, the principal method used in most, is grounded theory, right? So you ground the theory that you come up with in the data that you get. And that's really, most qualitative research in some ways is grounded theory research. You start with data and then you figure out what it means. My pen, no erasing. Okay. It tends to be interpretivist, right? You're wanting to find out the meanings that people attach to their own experiences. Constructivist in the sense that, social life is not fixed, but it's, basically created through people's interactions and their negotiation of their environment, their social environment, and therefore it's changeable, right? People are formed by their environment, but they also reshape their social environment in major ways. And most commonly, it takes a naturalist perspective, right? It is generally concerned, much more so than quantitative research, with trying to leave the social world undisturbed, right? So, you can think of like quantitative research as very artificial, right? When you give someone a survey to do, right? You're putting them in an artificial situation and you're asking them to sort of answer questions about their social world or about their life. The idea, at least, for qualitative research, especially, it's a little bit less true with interviews, but especially if we're talking about, say, ethnography, which we'll talk about, is basically to try and leave the social world as undisturbed as possible, to observe people in their kind of social world without intruding too much into it. We'll talk about different roles we can take. Okay, so our big kind of groupings of methods are these ones. We'll talk about each of them in turn. So, ethnography / participant observation, right? And basically, again, we'll go into great depth about ethnography and participant observation. Basically, this is where you would actually venture out into the world and sort of try to observe people out in the world, right, in their social environments. Technically speaking, that is called participant observation, and there's a bunch of different forms of it. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with the word ethnography. Ethnography can have some different aspects to it as well. A lot of ethnographies also involve doing interviews, but people will often use ethnography and participant observation kind of interchangeably, even though the words don't have quite the same meaning. Okay, so, this would be, right, as I promised furry-based examples, so I plan to deliver on my threat / promise. If you wanted to learn more about furries, right, what you might do is actually go down to the furry convention or whatever gathering furries have, either, with dressed as yourself and with a tag that says researcher on it, or maybe you adopt a furry persona or a fursona, if you will. That is actually the term that is used, is fursona. I've been informed by past generations of students. And you move amongst the furries in a covert way, pretending to be one of them to learn something about them, right? And those would be participant observations. Okay. So, this is method number one. No, number one method. Probably the number one qualitative method is straight up qualitative interviewing, right? Where basically, and you know what interviewing is, but you basically would sit down with, people that are part of a certain social circle or social world, and you would spend, somewhere between 1 and usually 2 hours talking to them. And typically this is done in either a semi-structured or unstructured way. So as opposed to what we were talking about when we were talking about quantitative research, right? If you were doing an interview with someone, it was a structured interview, right? You had your list of survey questions and you were like, rate your agreement with the following statement. Social methods is amazing, right? Do you strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, strongly disagree, or disagree, strongly disagree, or please kill me. Right? That's a structured interview where you're reading those questions and those options. Semi-structured, you have a list of questions, but you then can deviate from them, ask follow-up questions, have more of a normal conversation. And unstructured, man, you just like maybe have 2-3 questions and you just, free ball it from there. Okay, focus groups. So focus groups are interviews with several people together. There are lots of reasons to do focus groups, which I'll talk about later. But basically, you would gather a group of between like 5 and 15 people, have them sit around a table, and you kind of moderate the conversation between them, ask them some questions, and let them kind of respond both to you and to each other. Discourse and conversation analysis. This is a very linguistics, I think, kind of focused approach where you'd actually record people's conversations or watch people having a conversation, and kind of look at, how those conversations are progressing. And then qualitative content analysis. This is kind of like, you can think of what you would see a lot in English or film studies, where you take some kind of content, whether it's interviews or movies, TV shows, almost anything you can imagine, diaries, biographies, whatever you want, and you analyze them. You analyze what's in them, right? You look for themes and all of this kind of stuff. And again, we'll talk about that later in the course. There's a lot of this in qualitative research, not as much in sociology, but there certainly is some. And then participatory action research, almost exclusively a conflict theory sort of way of doing qualitative research, but basically where you have, you engage participants to produce social change, and often here the researcher is taking part in protests or social movements of some kind along with participants. Okay. I forgot, I have no question slides built into this. That's okay. Oh, that was 13 minutes. Wonderful. Perfect. So, how do you do this? What's the kind of normal process you move through with qualitative research? It's a Wednesday that feels like a Friday today. So, you start with general research questions, right? So, one of the things with qualitative research is your research questions are generally going to be considerably less specific than if you were doing quantitative research, right? Quantitative research is often, pretty focused in terms of its research questions, maybe referencing theories, or at least the hypotheses that you want to test. You're going to start with a much more general research question when you go to qualitative research. Because again, one of the things that you're going to tend to do is you're going to get data and then come up with your theory. So you need a fair bit of breadth in order to allow the data to speak, which means, generally speaking, a less specific research question. Okay, just like quantitative research, right? You figure out where you're going to, where you're going to do the research, and who your research subjects are. You collect your relevant data, right? So you get the data, you interpret the data, you come up with a conceptual or theoretical framework, and then maybe, depending on how it's going, maybe you refocus your research question. And we'll talk about this because both grounded theory and analytic induction, which are two of the kind of frameworks, bless you, that you can use in qualitative research, both have this kind of back and forth approach where you often go back and collect further data to check your theory until you reach what's sometimes called theoretical saturation. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But there can be a lot of back and forth. It's often not this straightforward process from 1 to 6, right? There's often a lot of back through this a few times. Collecting data, checking, if there's anything that doesn't fit the conceptual or theoretical framework that you set up. If there isn't, you rework your theory, go collect more data to see if now everything fits, and you kind of keep going over and over until you reach some kind of saturation, and then you can move on to the writing up findings and conclusions. Okay. All right. I just talked all of these through, but let's talk about it again. This is fun. Sorry, I went through everything here. General research questions, right? What interesting social issue are you studying, right? So you're trying to figure out how to write a qualitative question. Again, you want to be pretty vague about it. Okay, I should say a couple of things. One of the things I just want to take a quick step forward to check if I have. Okay, perfect. I don't have that, so I will talk about it here. One of the things you want to really stay away from when you're talking about qualitative research questions, and it can be a little bit tough, especially in this class where you've been working on quantitative, and now you're shifting to qualitative. One of the things that I often see, and one of the things that you want to stay away from, is any kind of formulation of a question that basically looks kind of like this. How does X affect Y? Right? Where here, X would be sort of an independent variable, and Y would be a dependent variable. So this is, or, other forms are like, what is the impact of X on Y? The reason I say that is L'Oreal and I, the TA, have a slight disagreement on whether you can use how in qualitative questions. In quantitative questions. She doesn't think you can use how in quantitative questions, but I'm the professor, so I win. Because that's how university works. The one with the most degrees gets to make the rules. But basically the structure here is, you can kind of slot anything into this sort of framework, and you've got a quantitative question, right? So what is the impact of smartphone use on depression, right? What is the impact of, watching pornography on religiosity, right? How does exercising affect mood, right? All of these kinds of things, right? These are all quantitative questions because you're looking at, you're slotting something into X and Y, and you're asking how one affects the other. You want to stay away from this kind of framing with qualitative, right? Because you're not really looking for the impact of one variable on another. So don't use, X affects Y. You want to frame questions, broadly speaking, so that they look at social phenomenon and especially try to get at people's experiences. So I think a typical framing is, what is it like to be a furry? Or what is it, what is the experience of furries living in Edmonton, Alberta? How does, living in an authoritarian society, no, that's a quantitative question. Actually, that could be qualitative. How does living in an authoritarian society affect how creators make films, right? Because you're asking about their experience. Like, okay, they're living in this kind of society. What's their experience of that, right? So you can use that framing, but don't do that because I just told you not to. Try to stay away from X affects Y, being like, what is it like to be a filmmaker in Iran, right? Use language that gets at people's experiences, right? Or, these kinds of broad questions. Do high crime communities have low social control? I don't love that question, but it came from the textbook. There you would be talking to people and, talking about going like door to door, interviewing people, seeing, what kind of social controls exist in their neighborhoods. You're not looking to quantify it. You'd be looking at people's experiences. So you can have questions like this. But I think what's really interesting is asking about people's experiences, right? Qualitative. The quality of people's experiences is what you're after. What is it like? How do they feel? What are their experiences? How do they interpret? These are all great qualitative questions, right? Okay. So, selecting, relevant sites and subjects. Where are you going to find people, right? So you're interested in this, in a particular research question, a particular topic. Where are you going to find the people to talk to you about, or what are you going to actually study? Because let's say my pen has stopped erasing. Oh, there we go. So what site? Where's the place that you're going to find, people who could answer this, who could answer these questions? Like if you're wanting to study the experiences of Iranian filmmakers, right? You're going to probably have to find a venue where you can talk to Iranian filmmakers. Maybe Iran, who knows? Where are the furries? Where are the single moms, right? What would be, where are they? The single moms that you want so badly to talk to in your research study. We'll talk about ethics again later. Don't sleep with the single moms you're interviewing. That would be bad. Objectively, like our researchers in the prison project, hilariously, like most of them are women, and they get hit on relentlessly by the people who are incarcerated that they talk to, and it's like, it hasn't really come up because they're not exactly the kind of people you'd probably want to get into a relationship with, but yeah, they do get hit on a lot. So it's always the conversation of, no, you are not allowed to sleep with participants. I do remember one person asking, well, what if they after the project's over, if they show up on my Tinder, would that be? And it's like, no, that would not be okay. Please don't ask questions like that. You may never sleep with research participants or single moms or whatever. No. Okay. Moving on. Where are the single moms? Oh. Okay. I'm like, what am I talking about? All right. The Wednesday that feels like a Saturday. Okay. So yeah, you got to figure out where your subjects that you want to talk to are. How are you going to get access to them, right? I'm just sorry. I'm fighting the giggles because now I'm like, how do you get access to the single moms? Like, I'm okay. Oh. Oh. Add time. Oh, maybe I need the projector to turn off so I can get a hold of myself. Okay, sorry, I'm being silly. I told you I was in a silly mood. Oh, 24 minutes. All right. So, there we go. I think we've talked about that enough, haven't we? Okay, then you collect the data, right? So you actually go, you either do participant observation, you do content analysis, you do interviews, you do focus groups, whatever it happens to be. You actually figure out what is going on, right? You collect data, you determine what your method is, obviously, figuring that out. And you can mix methods. We'll talk about that later. Yeah, it might be more appropriate, especially in qualitative research. We often use more than one method. So if you ever look at my dissertation, which again, you never should, I have interviews and I have content analysis. So lots of stuff. And yeah, you figure out what you want to do. Okay. You interpret the data, right? So once you have collected some data, and again, you may not actually collect all of your data all at once. You might start with a little bit of data, try and figure things out, try to figure out what it means, and then probably go back and collect more over time, right? Once you have interpreted your data, you try to figure out, what the theory is, what the theoretical and conceptual framework you want to talk about is, and then, you might rethink your research, tighten the research question, collect even more data, and kind of go until you reach theoretical saturation. And the last step is writing up your findings and conclusions. And this is where you get your master's or PhD, or your books, or your articles that get you the job, and all of that stuff. Okay, so I already spoiled everything on this slide, but that's okay. Qualitative research often involves either grounded theory or analytic induction, which are very similar. We'll talk about them later. Both of these approaches, use data to develop their theories, and they keep going back and back and back, essentially, revisiting the theory. They go back and forth from data to theory, revisiting and tightening the theory in the process, right? And yeah, you can, so quantitative research is all about theory testing, right? In quantitative research, you have your theory, and you develop hypotheses that you then test through data. You also get theory testing in qualitative research. It just looks a little bit different because you don't start with your theory, right? You develop your theory as you go. So you get data, you develop your theory, you then go test that theory by getting more data, and if you find something you didn't know, you rework your theory, and then maybe you go get more data until you're not learning anything new, right? And it's not kind of theory testing in the conventional sense. It's more this iterative kind of step-by-step process of building a theory, testing it with data, testing the revised theory with more data, and back and forth until you stop learning things. Okay. Okay, so I promise it's just water in my cup. Two kinds of concepts we can talk about. So when you're doing the major lab number 2, you're going to have to define your concepts just like you did with your quantitative research, right? Now, obviously, because you're not turning things into numbers, operationalization works a little bit differently, right? It's a little bit less straightforward. But you can kind of think of your concepts in your research, like key terms and key things that you're trying to understand, using one of these two kinds of ways, right? So when you're asked to define your concepts on the second major lab, you can definitely go with either of these, right? So the first one is definitive concepts. And basically you would do that, you would define those basically the same way you did on the first major lab, right? And that you did, I think, mini lab number 2, is that you would come at it and give a nominal and operational definition. Now, the operational definition is going to work a little differently in qualitative research because you're not going to be able to say something like, I'm going to use the UCLA Loneliness Index to measure loneliness. You're going to have to operationally define how you're going, you're going to have to define how you're operationally going to talk about a concept without turning it into numbers. Okay, so let's say you want to, let me think. You want to learn more about furries, right? So you want to figure out something about the furry subculture. So you want to learn why people adopt the furry identity, right? An identity as a furry. So to operationalize that qualitatively, you are going to probably ask interview questions. So like, if you want to operationalize it, always good with these strong I will statements. If you're working on your major lab 1 and you haven't operationalized things with an I will or a very definitive statement, please do that. But I will, you're not measuring, so you're not going to say measure, but I will use a nice qualitative word, interrogate the concept of identity or a furry identity by asking, question 1, question 2, right? You can list the kinds of questions you're going to ask or categories of questions you're going to ask about identity, right? So you could define, identity, using a nominal dictionary definition and say, okay, and I'm going to try and figure out what, how people create their furry identities, using interview questions in the following way. Or, you could be like, I'm going to analyze, online furry websites to see what kinds of, so you could do content analysis. I'm going to do a content analysis of online furry websites to see how people talk about establishing their fursonas, right? What different animals mean and all of that jazz, right? So you can see it's very similar to what you did in terms of quantitative research, but you're going to omit words like measure, right? You're not going to measure things because you're not trying to turn things into numbers. You're going to try to gain an understanding or interrogate or, some such term. Okay, so that's you can use a definitive concept to basically kind of structure things in your major lab number 2 and try to get a sense of what these concepts mean, right? Or figure out, how people are experiencing things. All right, sensitizing concepts. This is where you would give probably something that's much closer to just a nominal definition of a concept, right? So the idea behind a sensitizing concept, if you are putting something like that in, is maybe you're trying to learn about something you don't know. So you give a definition or a sense of the concept that's very vague, and then you kind of be like, I'm going to interrogate, what it means to have a subcultural identity, or what it means to be a furry, to have a furry identity. By looking at, these aspects of identity, and then you just kind of follow that down. So you give a very vague definition, and then with the idea that part of the final product of your research is going to be a much stronger, concept of, what it means to be a furry. Sorry, does that make sense? Am I making any sense at all? Okay. So it's just, you're just kind of leaving yourself open to exploring the concept with the sensitizing definition. Yeah, please.
Sensitization, would you then have to come back and then say this is kind of like what I've learned and this is how I now define it, or would you just leave it open for like the person reading through to understand?
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. I think what you would do is like in, say, a research proposal, you would say, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to explore this concept of identity, through these different lenses. And then at the end, like when you're writing up your research in step 7, you're going to be like, and this is what I discovered that identity means for, people in the furry community, what it means to have a fursona. This is how they define that. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you start with a very vague sense so that you can then, build it into something much more concrete as you do the research. And again, think of qualitative research and anything using grounded theory. Everything's very iterative, right? So you're doing it like one step at a time and building all the time. Good? Okay. Okay. How do we evaluate qualitative research, right? Because qualitative research, in a lot of ways, it sometimes gets a bad name in social science and in the academy in general, and people will sometimes, say it's very subjective, right? Or at its worst, people will call it flaky. Because it's not like quantitative research, right? Quantitative research is very easy to evaluate because you can take someone's numbers, right? Or you can look at the research method with which they acquired it, right? Was the method sound, right? Was their sampling method sound? Did they get a sound sampling method, right? Did they use some kind of random sampling or something else? You can run their, if they allow you, and they should, you can run their numbers again and check if their conclusions are valid. Qualitative research is a lot different because it's much more difficult to reproduce and to get that same sense. I mean, even if, say, and I know this is a debate in the field whether people should be like uploading the transcripts of their interviews, when they're writing research articles so that other people can check it. There's a lot of like non-verbal cues, right? Things that the researcher might experience that would be hard to reproduce in like interview transcripts. So it's much more subjective and much more difficult to evaluate. And so there are some kind of different criteria that people use to evaluate qualitative research. Trustworthiness, made up of credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability, and authenticity, right? Authenticity, the degree to which the research is transformative or emancipatory for the people studied and the society at large, right? So does it potentially produce social change would be authenticity. Also in some ways, does it tell the truth, right? Is it truthful in its approach, or is there some sense that it's being distorted? Okay, so credibility. So evaluating trustworthiness, this first criteria. Credibility, basically, one way to establish the credibility of research is to, look at whether the people studied agree with the interpretation of their thoughts and actions offered by the researcher. Okay, so this will often happen, right, with qualitative research. Once someone writes up their article or their book, they might bring it back to the people that they studied and sort of present it to see how those people feel about it. This is where actually focus groups can be really useful. If you did research with a group of people, you can kind of bring them in, do like a PowerPoint presentation, and kind of get a sense of what they think of the conclusions that you drew about their communities. Okay, so yeah, you do it through respondent or member validation. You can't just do it by sending the research to people. That's what I did with my dissertation. I just sent it to everybody I interviewed and basically was like, yeah, please go ahead and read it and let me know what you thought. And most of them were busy professionals, so I'm pretty sure they didn't read it. Not that makes me sad or anything. Worked really hard on that. Okay, so what can happen? Obviously, people can get defensive and try to censor the research. This is pretty tough to do, at an academic level, because research is really, really hard to censor. But if you were a grad student, right, someone might go to your supervisor and complain about the research that you did, suggest that something was done unethically, and they could cause problems for you. I've seen the occasional moment where people actually went to journals and tried to get articles taken down from academic journals, but because they're peer-reviewed, that generally doesn't go anywhere. Probably a bigger risk, the people studied might not give genuine feedback on what the researcher produced, but might actually just try to please the researcher, right? Most people are nice and pretty polite. And so, you might present your findings, and even if people didn't fully agree with it or they think you missed something, they don't want to make you feel bad and hurt your feelings. So they might, just tell you, oh, good job, sweetheart, and move along with their own lives because they don't care about your research as much as you do. There's not a question in the back, right? You were just fixing your hair? Okay, perfect. Not that I don't like questions, but all good. Okay. Or, this often happens depending on the kind of communities that you're dealing with. Either your research, by the time you get through it, can be too jargony, and the people that you actually interacted with might not have, the tools to understand what you're saying or to provide meaningful comments. And it depends, really. Vulnerable communities, this is especially true for. People might just not have the expertise to give meaningful comments. So credibility can be really useful, right? Getting people's feedback if they will be honest with you, but obviously it comes with those risks. Okay. So transferability. Can the findings be applied to other contexts or people not studied? Super. I love unprompted phone calls. Okay. So, can the findings be applied to other contexts or people not studied? This is basically, kind of, in a sense, generalizability. Most qualitative research isn't generalizable, and it's generally kind of hard to prove transferability of qualitative findings, mostly because they're very specific, right? Like if you spent, 6 months interviewing furries, right, and you really dug deep into the furry subculture, you moved amongst the furries, you in a sense became a furry yourself, who knows, right? You might be able to say certain things, right? And you might give like really thick descriptions, thick here being basically a euphemism for detailed, right? The goal of qualitative research is usually to give really detailed accounts of whatever social phenomenon you're studying. And I mean, if you have a really deep and detailed description, you might be able to kind of imply that some of what you found might be transferable to other groups, right? So let's say you're studying furries, because I'm going to go with this joke for as long as it holds. You might be able to say that the same kind of trends we see in furries might be seen in other subcultures. And you might be able to kind of establish that by looking at literature on other subcultures and saying like, look, I see, I have my rich description of the furry subculture, and we see this in, other literature on, punks or, I can't think of any other subcultures right now because my brain is dying. But you might be able to say that there's some transferability, which suggests, right, that what you found is valid because we see it in other kind of similar phenomenon, right? So your thick descriptions are going to provide enough information for you to make comparisons, and then for others to make comparisons from your findings to their studies later on. Okay. At a more kind of technical level, you can look at dependability, right? And this is basically an evaluation of whether the person doing the research followed proper procedures, right? Did you do the research correctly? Right? Do you know how, did you recruit people correctly? Did you, approach gatekeepers? Did you conduct interviews in a proper way? Did you make good field notes? Did you transcribe your interviews well, or were you working off memory, or all these sorts of things, right? If you followed proper procedures, right, this is all it's a methodological question. Then we can say that at least you followed the proper way of doing research. Okay, so generally, this can help establish whether the claims that you make, your theoretical claims, are justifiable, right? Mostly what you're looking for when you're talking about dependability is, was there kind of researcher bias in some of the way that the research was conducted, right? Did you pick certain examples that, let's say you're doing some kind of content analysis. Did you pick only examples that you thought would reinforce what you were trying to say? Did you pick a broad enough set of content to examine to make your case, right? Did you interview people from a broad scope of different positions within a community, right? Can you justify, or did you just pick the people that you knew would agree with you? Can you justify, your theoretical inferences? Now, sometimes this is, this can be established through auditing, where essentially you would hand your data over to someone else, and they would, do a kind of peer review, looking at your research and procedures to see if the study is dependable. This is pretty rare in qualitative research. It's really rare that someone would go to this level of detail. You see this kind of auditing much more commonly done in quantitative research, partially because quantitative data is just so much easier to work with in a kind of auditing function, right? It's really hard, like I said, to read through or even listen to hundreds of hours of interviews that someone conducted, right? Or even dozens of hours, get the full context, read through field notes and all of that stuff. So it's very rarely done, and in some cases it probably should be done. We have famous things like the SoCal hoax and the, what did they call it? The grievance studies hoaxes, where people basically created false qualitative data to see if they could get it published in prominent qualitative journals, especially in studies like gender studies and I can't remember the other ones. I want to say journals that focus on kind of critical race theory. They wrote these fake articles with fake findings and got a bunch of them published, and I think one actually got nominated for an award. Basically, because no one bothered to audit it and look at the data. It's relatively rare in qual. And yeah, it's time consuming and it's difficult with qualitative research compared to quantitative, right? It's really easy to rerun someone's numbers. Yeah, please.
I'm just curious on if you can give this information, if that's something that you guys are doing for your prison project, just because it seems like if you're interviewing subjects, I'm not sure what your question is.
Yeah, so the prison stuff is actually kind of more quantitative than qualitative. There's a big debate about this, and Sandra, I think it was Sandra and Kevin. I can't remember if it's Sandra and Kevin or just Sandra, but they wrote. Oh no, it's Sandra and someone else. I can't remember who it was. They wrote an actual open letter in the journal Criminology, because Criminology had basically said, anything we publish going forward, we need to basically have you upload your data into a database so other people can check it. And Sandra's point was, yeah, this, in qualitative data, this can be, depending on what the usage is going to be and how publicly available it is, it can be a problem. Like one of the things she said is in some of the research she did on police in Germany, she's like, anyone looking at that who was within the police departments, even if I gave someone a pseudonym, anonymized the data, they could have figured out pretty quickly who I had interviewed, right? Just by things like what their experiences were, what parts of Berlin they were talking about. So there's a lot of ethical debate about it. It would be something where, if someone's auditing your data, typically it's something that you would want to make sure was being done in a way that protected the data itself, especially if you're talking to, okay, like for me, if someone wanted to audit the data from some of the stuff I've done where I'm talking to like high-level executives at Sony, like who cares, right? Like they're not in that risk at all. But if you were talking to, illegal migrants who were at risk of being deported if someone figured out who they were, different story. And you probably want to make sure that you're keeping those, that data sealed in some way, even within the auditing process, so whoever's auditing it isn't posting it publicly. So I don't know if that makes sense. Did I answer your question is what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right. And confirmability, was the researcher objective and unbiased? And there's a bit of, right, did the researcher sway the results dramatically? And again, auditing can expose this. There is some debate, depending on where you fall in qualitative research, whether objectivity and being unbiased is even something that we should value. Some people will suggest, especially people who are more critical theorists, that actually we should be advocating for social change and you shouldn't be unbiased, especially where issues of justice, objective or unbiased, where questions of justice are at play. But this is definitely one of the criteria, right? If it's obvious that a researcher has skewed the data, maybe they have an agenda. Maybe they want to find something because it confirms long-standing theories that they have, right? You really don't want to see people kind of sway results by asking only certain people, by asking like leading questions, by selecting certain cases to study. And there's all sorts of examples of this, right? People will do this all the time, and even people will make up data. I remember, I won't say who it was, but one of the researchers in the department who had, has worked with everybody, but did a big research project with, a colleague out east. And basically this colleague published a bunch of findings from it. And then, they read the paper and they were like, I know this data because I helped them collect it. None of this is actually in the data. They just made all of this up, right? And sometimes people will do that because, they're trying to prove a theory that they've had. And so they'll make up data or they'll skew data. They'll give inaccurate quotes. All of these things, right? Cut off quotes in weird places, all with the idea of shaping the narrative, right? And confirmability is looking at that, going back and looking at data to make sure people didn't skew it in weird ways. Okay. I'm just curious how much is left in this. Oh, good times. Okay. So, this is the goal of qualitative research in many ways. Ooh, got bright out there. Nah. Can you see the screen okay, or should I put the blinds down? You're good? You're enjoying the sunlight? Okay. They were down when I came in here, so I put them up a little bit. So the idea is to see through people's eyes, right? You want to understand the social world from the perspective of the people who are living it, right? That's why you get, terms in qualitative research like, lived experience, which is a little bit of it's a little bit of a strange term because is there unlived experience? Probably not. What did a rock. I just stepped on something. It's just a rock. You want qual research. Those are all the same picture. So yeah, the goal is really empathy, right? Trying to create what's sometimes called an empathic understanding, probing beneath, and here you probably want to separate from a sympathetic understanding, right? A sympathetic understanding is where you would actually feel the same emotions that your participants are feeling. If you're feeling, too much sympathy, you may have gotten too close to your research subjects. But empathy, right, where you can sort of understand the emotions, maybe you don't feel the same thing, but you can actually, what people are feeling, and you can, kind of at least relate to it a little bit, is what we're going for, right? An empathic understanding of people's experiences. So we do this, by probing beneath the surface of social behavior. That's the purpose of like ethnography, right? Participant observation, interviews, and focus groups, right? Is trying to figure out why people act the way they do, what they're experiencing, what the context is in which their experiences are shaped, and all of that kind of stuff, so that we can see through their eyes, obviously metaphorically, and so you can describe the world as they see it, right? Whether they see the world objectively or not, right? Okay, so generally we do this, by looking at or giving in-depth descriptions with an emphasis on context, right? People's behaviors might seem odd or irrational, but if you really kind of get an understanding of why they're doing things, we can put them in context and make them more understandable. And yeah, we want to take typically a naturalist kind of view, so that as researchers, you're not imposing too much into the environment, so that you're getting people's natural reactions, right? There's all sorts of debates about this, and when we get to ethnography, probably next week, we will 100% talk about what this looks like, because it may look very different in different circumstances, right? And there's real questions as to ethics, the ethics involved in this as well, because clearly the best way to not, to maintain a naturalistic environment would be to lie about why you're there, right? To be covert, right? To be kind of undercover in the research that you're doing, say, especially if you're doing ethnography. But there are definitely ethical implications, to doing that. If you're like, I don't know, let's say, I'm going to give you a terrible example, one that will make you cringe. But if you show up to an AA meeting to find out more about what happens at an AA meeting, and you pretend that you're an alcoholic and you don't tell anyone that you're a researcher, right? You're intruding in a very, maybe you are a researcher and you are an alcoholic, but who knows? There's a large number of high-functioning alcoholics in the academy. I'll put it that way. I am not among them, and either that means I'm a low-functioning alcoholic or not an alcoholic at all. But it would be kind of unethical, right, to go where people are having these intimate conversations about their lives and pretend to be one of them. Yeah, please.
Kind of based off of an example, now I'm curious. So let's say, for example, there was a researcher, for example, that was an alcoholic, right, and they attend like some sort of like AA meeting themselves. Can, even though that they are then a part of that community, right, and they're not like vacant, can they still then do research in that environment?
It would be very fraught, right? It would be a really tough ethical space, simply because, if you're just going to those meetings, reporting, it's just how sensitive people are in those communities, right? They could be revealing really sensitive things. And if you don't reveal that you're there as an alcoholic and a researcher, an alcoholic researcher, this sounds like every academic conference I've been to. Sorry, I'm having flashbacks to my supervisor who was an alcoholic. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Not the one that's published on my thesis, the one I dropped before. I won't tell you their name, unless you ask me in private. Not on the YouTube recording anyway. It didn't go well. Anyway, no, we had a falling out. We haven't spoken in 7 years. But yeah, because it's so sensitive what happens there, I think that from an ethics perspective, you would take that to the ethics board and they would be like, I think you have to get everyone to sign off on, being part of your research, that anything you observe in this group, you'd have to be straight up. Although ethics boards have been known to do strange things, right? I think it would be pretty unethical to exploit people like that and be like, I'm an alcoholic too, so I can just now report on everything you said at the AA meeting. That's a very sensitive environment. So I would say that's probably not okay. I think the ethics board, if they don't shoot that down, then what are they even there for? Let's just, let's just run the Stanford prison experiment again and see how it goes. The U of A prison experiment, right? We can do anything. The ethics board is asleep at the wheel. No, they're pretty good. Yeah, I can't imagine them signing off on something like that. But this is where you get peak me being crazy. I described my lecturing style to one of the grad students as manic crazy person who writes all over their slides, which they said they had to come and watch at some point. I'm like, no, you don't. Okay, but yeah, that would just be such a fraught, place where people are being very raw. And I think you would be a kind of a crappy, even if you had permission, you'd be kind of a crappy person. If you were just like, I wrote this account of my AA group. None of them know. I hope none of them reads this and sues me, right? So you probably shouldn't. And definitely if you pretend, to be part of a community in order to get that is very ethically fraught. Like even if you were like, I really want to know what it's like to be a furry. And so you don a fursona and start to go among them pretending that you are a furry. That would be extremely fraught as well, right? Because suddenly you're not representing who you are accurately. Oh, I just hit 10,000 steps. How nice. It's possible. We'll talk about ethnographies because sometimes covert ethnographies get approved. But they have all sorts of interesting issues and problems. And unique dangers as well, because people might get really mad at you. I've heard of people doing covert ethnographies on gangs, and that sounds like a really bad idea to me, but you know, people do crazy things for science. Okay. I love Dilbert. Okay, not so much the creator of Dilbert, but Dilbert itself is hilarious. Okay, yeah. So one of the things that you want to typically do with qualitative research, you know, is kind of show the process. You know, figure out how things happened over time, right? How people got to a place, what kind of process they went through, you know, to develop, you know, to get to whatever place they ended up, right? So I mean, if you're doing like research on incarcerated people, like what led them to become incarcerated? Like what was their life story like? What was their experience like? Or if, you know, they went to prison and then they turned their life around, you know, what was that process like? This is the kind of things that are really interesting, right? Is that unfolding over time? I mean, my work on Russian TV was all about like starting in 1999, figuring out how we got to, I guess the last thing I wrote was in 2021, or no, 2022. You know, how did we end up with Russian TV in the shape it was in 2022, starting in, you know, 1999? What did that process look like, right? And I did this through interviews. I did this through content analysis. I watched a lot of bad Russian TV from the late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of telenovelas, actually. A lot of really weird Russian telenovelas based on Latin American ones. I'm trying to remember. Ugly Betty. There was a Russian Ugly Betty, and it was quite the thing. What was it called? I can't remember now. Be Not Born Beautiful, but I can't remember the Russian name of it. Okay, anyway, it doesn't matter. You know, but it's that process over time, right? So this can be done, you know, obviously through something like content analysis. You can go back in time and look at content from the past, move it forward, talk to people in interviews who are there, you know, who experienced things and have them recount it. Or, I mean, you could go and spend a long time in the field to understand, understand individual social change in its context, right? How things happen within particular communities, right? You go hang out at the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, ethically, I hope, you know, and you observe how people go from that first meeting to, you know, being sober for, yeah, I don't know, ever. Let's say forever, for a long time. We're being optimistic and hopeful. Okay. Semi-structured interviewing, right? Focus groups can also do this through that life history approach, right? People who are there or people who have experienced things can tell you about them. And like I said, content analysis, where you look at something, you know, like go pick up, oh, now I'm forgetting everything. I'm forgetting all the Russian titles of the shows I watched. Well, Maya Prekrasnaya Nyanya, the nanny spinoff, and talk about, you know, how it progressed from when it aired in like 2003 and how Russian TV changed until 2022, right? You can look at those progressions. You can look at interviews that people did in public press, all sorts of things, all with the idea of like, you know, what was your start date and how did things change to your end date? I always love the lag when my laptop mysteriously lags for no reason. The qualitative research koala has returned. I love him. He is my favorite terrible pun. Okay. And I'm out of water. Okay, so again, questions should be your research questions should be quite general, especially early in the research. Usually little or no theory driving your research. This isn't always true. Some people do come in with really strong theoretical orientations, but at least ideally, you know, typically because you want to be data driven and kind of sensitive to the data as you go forward, typically we don't go in with like a very defined theory that we're trying to test. And this is almost universally true of qualitative research. Inevitably, your project is going to change a lot as you go through the project, right? Almost no one who ever started a qualitative research project ended up studying exactly what they thought they were going to study, because, you know, you go in with a certain idea and then you discover things that are really, really interesting. My friend Kelly, she's a really interesting researcher. She's done like most of her research on MMORPGs, so things like World of Warcraft. And I mean, she went in basically wanting to see how people organized their parties in World of Warcraft and what the social dynamics were. And she ended up writing her dissertation on why men play as female characters in World of Warcraft, right? And it was all this kind of ethnographic work, all done in World of Warcraft, which was amusing. She had a character called the Survey Lady, and she stalked the World of Warcraft, pulling people over for interviews in World of Warcraft. And that was actually, like the name, the Survey Lady, some kind of elf. And, she wrote some of my favorite titled articles, like Big-Breasted Night Elves and the Men Who Love to Play as Them, which is my favorite article title ever. So sometimes you just you go in with an idea and you come out and you get interested in men who play as big-breasted night elves. And, because that is an interesting, why that gender play, right? Why are people playing around with gender in World of Warcraft? And how are they treated by other players when those players find out that they are in fact men? And I will spill the beans. Not well. When other men find out you're playing as a female avatar, they make fun of you and they're mean to you. And sometimes they kick you out of the guild or clan or whatever. I never played World of Warcraft because I'm not a nerd. No, I'm kidding. It's a fine game, I'm sure, if it still even exists. I don't know, nor do I care. Okay. The cool thing about qualitative research is that it's really flexible and it allows you to go off in all sorts of different directions, right? You can start with a very clear analytical focus, like something you really are interested in, and then you find something that's way more interesting. You know what? I will tell you this about myself. I am probably the world expert in the English-speaking world on Russian sitcoms. Why? Because I started my master's, I was like, I'm going to look at Russian news and look at Russian news as propaganda. Boring. But then I started watching Russian TV, and eventually I stumbled across these Russian sitcoms, and I was like, oh, these are fun. These are actually fun to watch. And basically, I've written probably the definitive work on Russian sitcoms that no one's ever read, because apparently it's interesting to me but not to others. But that's okay. I can live with that. You find interesting directions. It's very flexible, right? You can start with, hey, what's going on in terms of propaganda on Russian TV news? And then you're like, oh, hey, I watched that other thing. Let's shift off. You find something else interesting and you follow it down. And it's much easier to do that in qualitative research than quantitative. Is that a question? Yeah. Tentative?
Yeah.
This koala is eating a leaf. That's.
So the whole iterative process of improvement is guided by what you think is needed. For example, let's say you're thinking what you for
goes. Now, I mean, the risk with that is always, where do you stop? Because at some point, and this is where discipline and good supervision plays a role, especially as a grad student. I've known a few grad students that kept going down the rabbit hole and down the rabbit hole and down the rabbit hole and never graduated and fell into madness and possibly alcoholism. I don't know. We'll find out later. But yeah, I mean, you do have to stop at some point and kind of settle on a topic. But usually you arrive at that when you find the really interesting angle on something, right? Russian sitcoms or big-breasted night elves or, I don't know, something about the furry culture. I still haven't decided what about furries is exciting or different, other than I find them a funny example to use. Okay. All right, these are our possible goals. How many? I got 11 minutes. Sorry, Reg, in my peripheral vision, that looked like a question. Do you have a question? Okay, perfect. I didn't want to answer your question. No, I'm kidding. Of course I would. Our goals, seeing through the eyes of others, bring out that sense of process. I love having a flexible and unstructured method of inquiry, really understanding, a deep understanding of the people or group being studied, sometimes to the point of, all your friends and acquaintances are like, wow, that's your research topic? You know a lot about that. No one cares. But that's okay too. And, sometimes pursuing social justice and bringing about social change, that's the one that makes me uncomfortable because I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with activist research, but that's just me. Okay, our critiques of qualitative research. It's too subjective, right? And this is, I think in a lot of ways a fair critique. It can be very subjective, right? And it can be hard to make a case that your research is objective sometimes, because sometimes it's very much about your impression, your interpretation, or the subjective experience of people that you're talking to, right? Is it grounded in some kind of objective reality, or is that just what you or other people think, right? When we talk about ethnographies especially, bias can potentially result from personal relationships that develop during the research, right? You know, you're researching furries and you've adopted your fursona, and then, you know, you fall in love with Wanda, the woman who dresses as a ferret, right? And all of a sudden you're motivated to put furries in a better light, right? Because, you know, all of their strange practices that you might want to talk about, you don't want to make Wanda look bad, right? So you oh, I love the furry example. I think at the end of the term last year, right before the exam, I had two students walk up. They're like, "We don't know what we learned in this class. Was it all about furries?" And I'm like, "Oh God, I hope not." The furries were the joke to bring home the point, not the point in and of itself. Right, bias can bring, you know, especially this happens to ethnographers all the time. People start to sympathize with the people that they're studying, and they might be reticent, you know, to be honest about what's going on, right? They might scrub the data, or they might not give an accurate account so as not to offend those people. And yeah, it may be unclear as to how a particular topic or theme became the focus of research, right? How did you end up on big-breasted night elves? Why is that interesting? That can be hard to determine sometimes too. But it's where it's fun and cool. Okay, others, it's difficult to replicate, right? You know, often these are things that cannot be replicated. They're very specific. Often there's reactive effects, especially if you're in anything like interviews, right? You're in an artificial situation with interviews. There might be reactive effects and things like social desirability bias. You know, if you're there at, you know, the furry convention wearing a tag that says researcher, people might start to act weird around you for all sorts of reasons, right? So reactive effects can be expected. And then, you know, subsequent researchers might bring different reactive effects. So they might, you know, affect how their follow-up research goes forward. And yeah, generalization is really difficult because you're studying usually, I mean, I think really big qualitative projects might have, you know, 30 to 40 interviews. A lot of like PhD levels will have 10 to 15. So it's not a you know, a generalizable population. Now, the good news is that isn't the point, right? Generalization is not the goal of qualitative research. It's meant for an in-depth understanding, but, you know, where quantitative research can make the claim that this is an objective measure of what's going on in the world, qualitative research can't do that. That's not to say it's not valuable. It's just what it is. Okay, and its lack of transparency, right? It can be difficult to determine how the research was conducted, why certain people were chosen for in-depth interviews, or whatnot, right? And a lot of the time, you know, this is really common. Why were people chosen? Well, you know, it was a snowball sample. Oops. A snowball sample, right? You just went with whoever would talk to you. There was no actual process involved in selecting people at all. It's just whoever would talk to you, right? So your non-probability sampling, convenience sampling, and all of that fun stuff. I mean, hopefully it can be unclear how people came to certain findings. I think if you've done a good job, you know, say of writing up your research and explaining, you know, richly the details and the context, a lot of that should be mitigated. But potentially, you know, people could be like, okay, how did you jump from point A to point B? And yeah, it can be diminished by researchers keeping the detailed records of decisions taken at various stages of the research. You know, the more documentation you have, the more you can justify things. Things like field notes help a lot. Okay, anyway, I'm not going to, is this my last slide? Okay, I've got a couple, but let's not kind of dig too deep into this, right? I think we have a good sense for the most part of what the difference between these kinds of research is. I mean, especially numbers versus words, right? We're describing things. I'll list them off quickly. You yeah, with qualitative research, you're more interested in the view of the participants, and the researcher tends to be really relatively close to the researchers, right? You're interacting with them at least once. Theories and concepts tested versus developed from the data. Quantitative research is very structured. Qualitative can be very unstructured. And yeah, we're looking for contextual understandings rather than generalizable knowledge. Okay, same here. Theory development is the key. Not hard, reliable data, but rich, deep data. And we're looking at the micro level, right? Relationships, people's understandings and such, what meaning they make out of their surroundings, and hopefully in a natural setting. Okay. Oh, that wasn't a question, was it? You're cheering that the class is over?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Okay. I'll try not to take it personally.
No, it's not you. I swear.
I'm kidding. All right, we're done for today. We'll come back on Monday and we will talk about next topic. What is next topic? Next topic is ethnography. So we'll talk about ethnography through most of next week. What? I think it is from noon to 1. Yeah, it's noon to 1, so that shouldn't affect this class. I checked. Yeah, it doesn't affect me because it's from noon to 1, and I don't teach from noon to 1, so I don't have to cancel classes, which is good because I have a midterm scheduled on Wednesday at 1, so that would be bad. Okay. Oh, I had the mic turned off. There we go. Oh.
What was the result in that experiment? Sorry.
In which experiment?
In like the males choosing big-breasted elves as their characters.
So a lot of them, were just super, like, maybe gender fluid, gender curious. A lot of them, it was just like they liked it and it allowed them to play with kind of like gender norms, right? They felt more comfortable in that. What's that?
Because they suck at play.
They suck at playing?
It's normally the ones that suck at play or the ones that are extremely good.
Okay.
Because if they suck, like they're always it's a woman, like whatever.
Okay.
But if they're super good, it's like
yeah, and I mean a lot of it was like they just really liked it, and some of them wanted to experiment with, different gender roles. But then, yeah, they did not get good reactions from their fellow players, right? Male players who found out that a man was playing as a female character tended to ostracize them. They got kicked out of kind of their group. Some of them ended up using like voice changers, so that they could, yeah.
like because there's like so many like 10-year-olds that play a game that I play, and I just go and I use very like ladylike voice, and then I switch into a very masculine voice.
Okay.
And then they get so scared and they stop insulting.
That's funny. I think isn't there like a YouTuber that does that?
I don't know. I just enjoy it because they start insulting